an incredible human being, somebody that we've had the great honor of having as our chair for a number of years. He is also involved in the litigation that the children are waging against the government for climate change and a whole host of other major activities across the country. So, Gerald, take it away.
Thank you. It's actually my honor tonight to introduce someone who actually needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Denis Hayes. The reason we're all here tonight, actually, goes back to the time he decided to leave the Harvard Law School to undertake to organize the first Earth Day in which 20 million Americans came out, demanded action on the environment, and out of that grew what are the various environmental laws that we take for granted now. Right? But it wouldn't have happened if those people hadn't been mobilized, if they hadn't demanded that their representatives act, and it wouldn't have happened if he hadn't been able to mobilize a team that built out that entire effort. As we build towards the 50th, we want the 50th to be an international replica of what Denis produced in the United States in 1970. Make no mistake, it takes a boatload of work. And Denis has always been modest about the amount of work it took to produce that. But you shouldn't be. You deserve every accolade that comes your way. I'd like to introduce Denis Hayes.
Thank you very much, Gerald. That introduction would have sung a bit more sweetly in my ears if he had not come over just before he came up here and said, "So Denis, you ready to go, or should we let them enjoy themselves for a little while longer?" A lot of things came out of that first Earth Day, and we mostly know about them. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Marine Mammals Act. It rolls off. There were about 15 pieces of important federal legislation in 5 years. And Richard Nixon, not exactly an environmental champion, set up the Environmental Protection Agency with an executive order and made the decision to do it on the afternoon of Earth Day. So it's a decent legacy, but I'm going to talk about something a little more personal for a moment. Something that happened that came out of that first Earth Day, which is I met my wife. She interviewed me for a television program, and she was pretty good looking. And so I asked her for her telephone number, and she declined to give it to me. And I got it from one of her co-hosts and called her up the next time I was in Los Angeles, and it went on. And it may well be that many people around the world have benefited from that first Earth Day, but by far the greatest beneficiary was my daughter, Lisa. Because it's a simple equation. No Earth Day, no Lisa. So it's been 48 of them now, and I've been at a number of exotic locations in Germany and the Ukraine and South Africa. On every Earth Day, I always text message, or in the early days, telephoned Gail, just with a little recollection of how we came, and it's something that's, I think of at least as endearing. So this year I had the quietest Earth Day that I've had in a half a century, realizing that Kathleen was going to be sending me out on the road for 2 years. And so this year I stayed in my neighborhood and with a whole bunch of my neighbors, we went out and got invasives out of a park that they were destroying, mostly English ivy. In the middle of that, I found myself sweating, hot as a dog, thirsty, panting, pre-heart attack kind of condition. I mean, this is not a workout with the Atlantic Falcons. I was pulling out English ivy, and I text Gail and said, you know, it's been a really good run, babe, but I think I might be slipping into middle age. And nanoseconds later, she texts back, the only way you are, quote, slipping into middle age is if you're planning to live to 150. This, I should say, is the woman who 12 years ago, as I was approaching 60, in a fairly public circumstance, proclaimed that, at least for me, becoming a sexagenarian was not going to be anything like it sounds. You've heard tonight from a great many women, and this event is largely a women's event, and Earth Day has, to a far greater extent than is commonly appreciated, been a women's event. It turns out that in 1970, when we started trying to organize teach-ins on college campuses were caught up in the anti-war movement. They were caught up in the civil rights movement. The last thing they wanted to do was a teach-in because that was passé. And so when we were on the verge of a belly flop on this environmental teach-in business, we went through all of the mail that had come into Gaylord Nelson's office and found out that 90% of it was from women. It was from women who had young children, women who often had children who were suffering from air pollution, were suffering from any number of environmental maladies, and this issue just resonated with them. Most of the key organizers in that first Earth Day were women. And this is biased a little bit because I am who I am, but for decades I never met a member of a state legislature, a U.S. representative who was a woman, a member of a public utility commission who didn't come up and say, hey, the very first political thing I ever did in my life was Earth Day 1970. That connection has been there from the very start. So these events where we honor women in the economy, these events where you bring up a whole bunch of young women who are about to become prominent in the next few years environmentally because they are getting good science backgrounds. This is, in some very large measure, what we are all about. It's the Kathy Kelvin's comment that you cannot be an environmentalist without being a feminist, and I think the obverse is true. You can't be a feminist without being an environmentalist. I'll take Ovi's comment as well. Every parent cares deeply about his kids. That also is a great vulnerability for environmentalists because every parent wants to be a hero to his kids. So every time that we can unleash 60, 70, 80 million little green gorillas and send them home to ask their parents to do something, it gets done. Looking forward, next year is going to be, we have a theme most years. In 2020, it will be this broad encompassing theme of human ecology and how we literally save the world. Next year, it's going to be endangered species. This is something where the connection is not as obvious to everybody about the human Earth Day connection, but it is. It's where drugs and medicines come from. It's where much of what enriches life comes from. And what E.O. Wilson refers to as this epidemic of extinction that's spreading around the planet just has to be stopped. Extinction, as the old bumper strip would have it, is forever. And we have a whole bunch of things, many subspecies now. The northern white rhino, the western black rhino, African elephants, Asian elephants, migratory birds that for time immemorial ever since the dinosaurs have been flying thousands of miles through what are now myriad countries to move from one nesting ground to the next, are now becoming increasingly endangered. Some of them 50, 60, 70% of the population has dropped as we are destroying the wetlands that they rely upon. We're destroying the fields that they used to nest in. So this is something that we are going to be pitching very, very hard next year, and hopefully we'll have the same kind of resonance that plastics had this year. And it feeds into 2020 because 2020 is going to be about things globally. And endangered species don't recognize political boundaries. They go where they have to go. Some of those birds are really lucky. They take off from Siberia and they fly nonstop for 7 days until they get down to New Zealand, but most of them have to put down along the way to refuel, and their refueling stations are disappearing. We're going to have a strong marine aspect to it as well. And you will be hearing all about Earth Day 1919 as the year proceeds. Earth Day 2020. The Earth every now and then has an inflection point. Often these come from things that humans are merely reacting to. We had an inflection point with the Great Depression. We had an inflection point with World War II. Arguably, we had a fairly impressive inflection point with the invention of the personal computer and distributed intelligence and artificial intelligence. Every now and then, those inflection points come from a human choice. The civil rights movement was a choice. I mean, conditions had been abysmal for hundreds of years, and suddenly a group of leaders decided, we're not going to take this anymore. You can't tell us we're not going to sit at that lunch counter. You can't tell us we got to move to the back of the bus. You can't tell us we can't go to your universities. You can't tell us we can't vote, and simply refused. Put their bodies on the line. You won't serve me at your lunch counter? Well, I'm going to sit at this lunch counter until you serve me. And if you don't, then you'll just have all your stools occupied for the entire day. Took human behavior and changed the world. Earth Day has been one of those kinds of events where we took a random day, for heaven's sakes, April 22nd. If I had it all to do over, trust me, we would not choose one of the rainiest days in most of the civilized world. And it pulled together this awesome combination of people at a time when we did not have social networking, when we didn't have the capacity to go out with our iPhones and take pictures of pollution and feed it into a billion-strong database, when we couldn't do what we're going to be doing for 2020, talking to pretty much every museum in the world to put on environmental displays as part of their educations, to zoos and aquariums to tie them into it. Every activist group from whatever the kinds of particular foci are that they have, we're going to try to teach them the environmental attributes of that. I'm particularly eager to get some of my fellow geezers at the AARP into what I'm calling the gray-green kind of alliance. Because a lot of them now have time on their hands and have substantial resources and can work well with young people who have the passion, the drive to bring about change here and every place else. But as Ovi was talking about the need for a team, you are our team. We don't have a membership base. The Earth Day Network scrambles. It is relatively impecunious. It gets an enormous amount of bang for the buck. But if we are to succeed, it will be because the people in this room fan out, talk to your friends, and that's pretty old-fashioned. Email your friends, and text your friends, and Facebook your friends, and tie it into all of the themes that we have. We have to have a terrific, I mean, admittedly, Donald Trump has made it something none of us much want to touch anymore, but we have to have a terrific Twitter response on thing after thing after thing. The power of #MeToo has, I think, awakened the world to the power of this sort of thing. It will result not just in gross embarrassment to every single member of my gender, but also in lasting cultural, lasting economic, lasting political changes. We've got And it does that because it's instance after instance after instance, and you tie them all together with this one hashtag that locks them in. I wish to hell there were not so very many of that particular thing to tie together. Every day it's one more person that I'd sort of thought of as exceptional. It turns out to be horrible. But with the environment, we have myriad things out there. Very few people know that on average over the last 2 years, 3 environmental activists a week have been assassinated somewhere in the world. You tie that together with a hashtag and it starts to resonate a little bit with people. You find issue after issue after issue and you tie it together with something that is, and I don't know what, there will be a hashtag Earth Day 2020, but it will have something on it, maybe in my backyard too, or something that ties it into a theme that pulls the world together in this. Because doing things as we've been doing them have been hard as hell, and yet compared to what we have to do now are comparatively easy. That's to say, we have been working inside nation states. You know, the politics have been tough, but inside a country, you know what to do to pass a law. You know what to do to start a consumer boycott. You know what to do in any number of ways to bring about lasting change. But now we're facing things like climate change that no single country can solve by itself. Nuclear proliferation, which no country can solve by itself. Plastics in the marine environment that no individual nation can solve by itself. Migratory species flighting in country after country after country that you have to capture every one of those nations into. I don't think there's ever been anything that is successful toward that end in the past, and we've got to do it. We've got to do it because of those inflection points I was talking about. There are now some natural inflection points. There are some tipping points that the world, probably a couple that we've already passed, certainly others that are looming out there in front of us where you have positive feedback loops, and once you've crossed that line, it just gets worse and worse and worse. And we've got to avoid those lines, and it can only be done on a global basis. That's why the United Nations Foundation is such an important instrument for us. So, with all of that said, my bottom line message here is we are being as audacious now as we were in 1970 in the sense of setting out to do something that had never been done before. But what we're setting out to do is vastly harder. And so I hope that all of you will be joining with us in that effort as colleagues, as compatriots, as friends, to the extent that anyone really has a friend on Facebook anymore, and as people who will help us build an unstoppable movement. With that, it is my great honor to introduce a dear old friend. Andy has been writing about the environment. He's been writing about climate change. He's been writing about, I guess, first about the rubber tappers that was assassinated down in Brazil. It was the first book and the first time that I ever encountered him. Having followed his career for a couple of decades at the New York Times and then at .Earth and then at ProPublica, I'm now pleased to announce tonight to those of you that don't know it that he has joined National Geographic as a, Kathleen, what? Wow, with all of that, please, Andy.